This month sees the release of Josh Trank's Capone, starring Tom Hardy as the infamous bootlegger and gangster Al Capone. Capone attained notoriety as the crime boss of the Chicago outfit in the 1920s. Unlike most gangsters of his time, Capone did not hide in the shadows, pulling the strings from some elusive dark corner. Rather, he was front and center in the media, made public political alliances, and became a famous and even loved figure among the public. This sentiment is felt even today, transported to the big screen, with cinema audiences having a fascination with gangsters on screen as portrayed in mob movies such as Goodfellas and Once Upon a Time in America. Trank's movie is his first since his much mangled Fantastic Four film in 2015, massacred by critics and plagued with rumours of poor behaviour from Trank on set and a war between him and the production studio over creative differences. He was subsequently fired from a Boba Fett movie which has yet to be made. As much as people love gangster movies, they love redemption tales even better, and Capone has the chance to be Trank's return to the limelight. As we anticipate the arrival of the latest depiction of Al Capone, let's take a look at the various portrayals of the gangster in cinema over the years. It's widely believed that the protagonist Rocco in 1931's Little Caesar, played by Edward G. Robinson, was inspired by the life of Al Capone. This, however, is not correct, as he was actually inspired by Sam Cardinella, another Chicago mobster who operated in the early years of Prohibition. The very first time we ever saw Al Capone on screen was in Howard Hughes's and Howard Hawks' 1932 crime film Scarface, played by Paul Mooney. Technically, they never mention that it's Al Capone, but the film is based on a 1929 novel of the same name that was inspired by the life of Capone and the headlines his escapades were generating during his peak in the bootlegging Prohibition era. The memory of Al Capone was still fresh in the minds of audiences, as Capone was sent to prison only a year before the film's release. The Hays Code, a set of rules governing what was permitted in American films, would be adopted in 1930 but not properly enforced by film studios until 1934, meaning that Scarface was one of the last American films that was allowed to revel in a kind of violence that would never be seen again for decades. The crime films that followed Scarface and were inspired by it were limited to telling stories where the good guy always wins and crime never pays. Scarface would later be remade by Brian De Palma in 1983, starring Al Pacino in the role of Tony Montana, although by this point, Scarface had been reinvented to such a point that it bore little resemblance to the life of Capone, instead telling the story of a Cuban immigrant who builds a drug empire. What did remain was the larger-than-life, almost caricature performance from Al Pacino. After the original Scarface, there were several movies and characters that were inspired by Al Capone, such as Edward G. Robinson's character in the 1948 film noir Key Largo, but it was not until 1959, 9 years after a ban on gangster biopics was lifted, that we got an actual biopic of Capone, called Al Capone, and starring Rod Steiger as Capone. This movie is considered the first authentic film biography of the gangster. Steiger turned down the part 3 times, and when he did accept, he demanded major changes in the script, which included a punishing end for the gangster, which not only included the 11-year imprisonment Capone would face in Alcatraz, but other elements, such as his criminal lifestyle being condemned by his wife in the film. The next biopic of Capone was released in 1975, starring Ben Gazzara as Capone, and sharing the same name as this new biopic starring Tom Hardy. By the time this film was made, the Hays Code was long since abolished, and it was also produced by legendary producer Roger Corman, who often produced exploitation flicks. As a result, the movie contained far more sex and violence than the 1959 picture, and this film takes the condemnation of Capone several steps further, by including his incarceration, as the last film did, but also his contracting of syphilis and the start of his mental deterioration. The last few scenes of the movie take place after Capone's release from prison, where his mind is no longer what it once was. He's trapped in memories filled with violence and hate, and is unable to recognize the people around him, a limp ending to a man who was once considered untouchable. In 1987, Brian De Palma made a film called The Untouchables, based on the series that started in the 1950s, concerning the team that would help put Capone away on tax evasion charges. In this film, Robert De Niro is given the mantle of Capone, though unlike the previous films, Capone is not the centre character this time around, instead being the centerpiece villain in what is a stylish blockbuster version of a cops and robbers game. In tune with the tone of the film, De Niro's Capone is almost as wacky as Pacino's Montana, being a cigar-chomping, cackling hothead who unloads his fury on anyone willing to deliver him bad news and murders his own henchmen. All he needed was a moustache to twirl in order to complete the set. In spite of this, De Niro bashing one of his subordinates' heads in with a baseball bat perhaps remains the most iconic scene of Al Capone in film history. Much of the film is fiction, but reaches the inevitable conclusion it must reach in the end, with Capone being sent to jail. Capone's life since his incarceration is not explored in the film. The next Al Capone was played by F. Murray Abraham in a little seen, poorly received 1995 picture called Dillinger and Capone, featuring a strange fictional story in which Capone and mobster John Dillinger team up for a bank heist. Perhaps the most loved and cherished version of Al Capone doesn't even belong to a movie, but the TV series Boardwalk Empire, where British actor Stephen Graham played the role of the mobster over the course of 5 seasons. Though a supporting character, the series still charts the rise of Capone as a henchman for Johnny Torrio, and his term as boss of the Chicago outfit, including his rivalry with mobster Dean O'Banion. As by this point is tradition, Graham's Capone is a brash and unhinged individual, with the series introducing elements such as a drug addiction, and with what TV is allowed to get away with these days, the violence Capone dishes out is much more extreme than what we've previously seen. Capone's final scene in the show is of him going to court for tax evasion, where history tells us he will of course end up in prison. Which brings us to the latest rendition of Capone, with Tom Hardy standing on the backs of some great actors who gave some brilliant performances. It seems from the film's description and trailer that the movie might be a fusion of all the different elements of previous Capone films, most notably the 1975 picture, with Hardy looking like he will be spending most of the movie in Capone's later years, riddled with syphilis and dementia, sprinkled in with flashbacks to Capone's violent past, where Hardy can channel his inner De Niro and Graham. Unlike previous Capone films though, this one will seemingly begin at the end, dooming Capone from the start by highlighting no matter how much glitz and glamour we see in the flashbacks, a deranged and confused shadow of his former self is how this legendary gangster will end up. Thanks for watching.